everybody, welcome to Paranormal Zone TV, a live broadcast. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. We have a great show, and tonight I have a special co-host with me, Dave Spinks, and we also have a very, very special guest, Frank Feschino Jr. So let me start with this. My co-host tonight is Dave Spinks. He's a paranormal researcher, television personality. He's featured on numerous paranormal-themed television shows and 2 feature movies, and author. His book is The Real West Virginia UFO Sightings and Close Encounters Revised 2022, along with about 14 or 15 other books which can be purchased on Amazon. So Dave, before we start with Frank, would you please tell the viewers about yourself?
Sure, Norene. Thanks for having me on. I'm excited about this show. I've been investigating and researching the paranormal for about 38, 39 years now. You guys have seen me on Norene's show, and for those that you haven't, you can check out all my stuff on my website. It's www.davespinkspi.com. If you want to see upcoming appearances and things I've got in the works, just go over there and check that out. I do it all. I don't just do UFO stuff. I do hauntings and cryptids, so all of it really fascinates me, and I think a lot of it interlocks and overlaps with each other. Tonight we have a great guest on. This man, has spent 30 plus years of his life investigating one case, and during that time he uncovered other things that were also cover-ups, which he'll tell you all about when we have him on. So I'm super excited to be a part of this. So go ahead, Norene, introduce your guest.
All right. So tonight we have a very special guest, Frank Feschino Jr. He is the world's most thorough investigator of this UFO incident in history. He is the author of the Braxton County Monster Updated and Revised Edition, The Cover-Up of the Flatwoods Monster Revealed. Hold on. And Shoot Them Down, the Flying Saucer Air Wars of 1952. Frank will share with us the true, chilling, one of the most baffling cases in UFO history. His ongoing and diligent over 30-year investigation into this case reveals an invasion of a gigantic aliens that occurred over America September 12, 1952. The cover-up of a U.S. Air Force jet fighter which vanished on that night after 60 years of conspiracies and cover-ups. Learn what the government has held back from the American public since 1952. The summer of the biggest UFO flap in U.S. history. So with that, let's welcome Frank. Hey, Frank, then welcome to the show. Thanks for joining us.
Glad to be aboard. Hi, Norene. Hey, Dave.
Hey, Frank. What's going on, brother?
Okay, Frank, so before we start, would you please tell the viewers about yourself?
My name is Frank Feschino Jr. I'm a graduate of Park School of Art in New Haven, Connecticut, near Yale University, and I have a degree in film and video production as well. When I was living in Connecticut, I went to art school, and then when I moved down to Daytona Beach area, I got an associate's degree in film and video production, and during that time I came onto the Flatwoods Monster case, and it basically started out as a small school project, and then it evolved and it kept getting bigger and bigger. I have some family up in Braxton County, and I would stay there throughout the years, and I got a lot of people on interview that have never been interviewed before, and I'm about 30 years now into the Flatwoods Monster case, and I'm still going on it every day too, Dave. As you well know, I've spoken to Dave about this, and every time I do broadcasts, I've done something like 300 radio shows, and it seems every time I do a radio show, I have people contacting me and sending me JPEGs with more information. I have my book here. This is the revised and updated book. And Dave, I could probably have about 5 more renditions of that book, because every time I turn around, I'm adding more stuff. Basically, what I do is I just put the new information up on the internet.
Wow.
Yeah,
All right, so what I'm going to do, Dave, would you please start the show with your questions for Frank?
yeah. I'd be more than happy to, Noreen. And I gotta say, I was born in Gasaway, just down the road from the Flatwoods, where the Flatwoods Monster incident happened, and I grew up my whole life hearing from my mom's first cousins and stuff how terrified they were of this thing. And being a local, I was privy to a lot of information over the years. And I discovered Frank because he's a little older than me, and I discovered Frank when his book when he wrote about that, and I actually saw him and Stanton Friedman at a conference here, and I was just blown away by the work that Frank did on this case. And that was way back when, and I always give him his props, because it's not often, and it's very few and far in between, that you hear of someone that has dedicated essentially half of his life to one particular case. And that's just unheard of. And there's a lot of people that regurgitate Frank's information as if it's their own, and it's not their own. It's Frank's work that they're doing. Now, you had a few people, before Frank, like Gray Barker and some other people, but Frank went way more in depth. He became good friends with the Mays and used to eat dinner with them on a regular basis and hang out with them. And he'll tell you a funny story. I'll let him tell it when he first started hanging around West Virginia, how they treated an outsider, because there was a lot of scrutiny on this case, and the government came in and literally tried to cover it up. It was a cover-up. It still is a cover-up. And Frank experienced all kinds of things over the years. So I'm going to ask him a few questions, because I think people, normally you want to hear about the case, but he's going to tell you all about that. But I want people to understand the time and effort this man put into this case. And I think it's important for people to understand that. So with that being said, Frank, I got to throw a few questions at you. I hope you don't mind. And I don't know if anyone's ever approached you like this before, but I'm going to. So if you don't like it, tell me to shut up and I'll stop. Okay? So, having spent all those years researching and investigating this case, what we've talked about this, you and I, what do you think there's something specifically about West Virginia in general, of them having not only the Flatwoods Monster case, but some of the most prolific UFO sightings encounters of all time? Do you
Well,
think
the Flatwoods case, Dave, when I started it out, I was just basically doing research back in the early 90s. Actually, 1991 I started. And my cousin had a 400-acre farm with crop circles appearing overnight. I was talking to the locals, and I found out the UFO sightings in Braxton County were still going on, and they were frequent. I found out about the Flatwoods Monster case, and I started researching it. And what I found out about it is, back in the early 90s, I had no internet. And I did all my research through libraries and books. And I had between 50 and 60 different books about the Flatwoods Monster. And they were like anywhere from a paragraph to a couple pages. And Dave, every single story was different. The story had changed so much over the years. It was crazy. So
that intrigued you, right? That intrigued you, or you wanted to get to the bottom of this story, because you had all these people talking about different things that didn't make sense.
Right. And I basically went, my main source right off the bat is I was able to contact Kathleen May, who was a primary witness who saw the monster up close and personal. And from that point, she started referring me to other people. I'm from Connecticut. I was considered an outsider. I would go into Sutton with my cousin, and I was threatened. I had people flapping open their jackets, showing me guns strapped onto their chest. And Dave, I heard it more than once. Boy, we don't talk about the Flatwoods Monster up here no more. You got it? And they were pretty serious and somewhat mean about it, getting their point across. So That was kind of uncomfortable.
Why do you think that is, Frank? Because they were made fun of, basically, right?
They were basically ridiculed, and they still are to a certain point. But what happened is I basically became a representative for the May family because I was the first person to pull out all the Project Blue Book documents about September 12th, 1952. And this actual book, I showed Kathleen May. There's over a pound of paperwork here, Dave. All of these are the UFO sightings that occurred. These are intelligent documents from Project Blue Book. There's a pound of paperwork here of what occurred that night. The Flatwoods Monster was basically the end of the story. And I know every story has a beginning, a middle, and an end. Flatwoods was the end of the story. And I started researching then with newspaper articles. I went to West Virginia countless times. I was going to the Charleston Library, libraries all over West Virginia and throughout the Northeast. Then I started making phone calls to different libraries throughout the Northeast. And I wanted anything and everything to do what was said to be a meteor or a UFO. Well, that's when the story opened up, Dave. And it took me about 5 years to go through the Project Blue Book documents. And this map that's behind me is the master map. And that is basically how I was able to solve this story. The Flatwoods Monster actually was a damaged craft that flew over the eastern seaboard and passed over Washington at treetop level. It was damaged, and it flew approximately a little over 200 miles west, went into upper part of West Virginia and Burnsville, then turned south and was seen coming through Braxton County. It landed on the Bailey Fisher farm. Everybody has been talking about the Flatwoods Monster for years. Is a monster roaming the woods that had a cloak on with a wood with scary arms, and that was just a big myth. That, you know, we could go into that later. That happened on a television show when the sketch artist drew the picture incorrectly, and he misinterpreted the witnesses' interviews, and he drew this ridiculous-looking picture. Well, the Flatwoods Monster was actually a mechanical craft. And I have documentation going back to within a couple days after it was released in the Charleston Gazette, and the Flatwoods Monster was referred to as a mechanical man. Then we have this fella here where they made lanterns. This is what people think the Flatwoods Monster has looked like for years, and this is what it actually looked like, Dave. This is a sculpture that I made. Here is the real Flatwoods Monster. It was a mechanical machine. This is the incorrect one. So for years, everybody thought it looked like a monster with arms and claws, but in reality, it wasn't. And I just ran with the story.
To you, right? The original eyewitnesses described that to you, and you crafted that, right?
That's correct. What I did is I worked with Kathleen May, and then I worked with her son, Freddie, very close. Kathleen May, as she put it, quote unquote, she was the length of a car, a small car, away from this thing. When it landed on the hill damage, it relocated into another part of the farm. This entity got out of it, which was a hovercraft, and it hit up behind a tree along a dirt path on the Bailey Fisher farm. And when the boys at the school playground saw this thing pass over, they all went to Kathleen May's home, which is on Depot Street. That was where the access road is going up to the farm. And they all went up onto the farm, and that's when they ran into this thing. They had no idea what it was. And I'm going to show you, Dave, I'm going to reach out of sight. This is an original, not a copy. This is what Freddie May drew with me. This is his description of the fireball that went over the Fisher farm that night. Well, I worked with Freddie for several years. I worked with Kathleen May. And I've said this before, I just didn't do one or two interviews with them. I spoke to them for hundreds of hours over the years. And when I was trying to figure out what this thing looked like, because it had turned into a myth, which it wasn't, I would sit down with the maze and different witnesses, and I would do sketches. I'm an illustrator, so I did is what Stanton Friedman always referred to as like police sketch artist type
Yeah.
drawings.
Yeah. So,
And then from those drawings, I went into comprehensive. I did a couple steps further, and then I would go back to West Virginia and I would show the maze. Did it look like this or a little bit more? And when we got to the point of where it actually, where they said this is as close to what it looks like, that's when I did the full-blown illustrations that you see. Then when I came out and I went public with these illustrations, back when my first book came out in 2004, everybody from around the world was contacting me. Why does the monster look like a rocket ship? We thought it was a monster wearing a hood and a dress with claws. Well, that was just the myth and a misinterpretation of it. But sitting down with the witnesses, it was actually a mechanical device, Dave.
yeah. So, on your first book, Frank, tell folks what kind of horrible time you had with your first book and with your publisher and stuff, because people don't understand what you went through after you published the first book before the revised edition.
Basically, in a nutshell, and I've been advised by my attorneys that I can't talk too much about it because I don't want a lawsuit. But basically what happened is my book was edited without my knowledge incorrectly, and I never saw the final proof. And when it went to print, it had approximately 225 mistakes in it. And I was on book tour.
How many years did it take you to get the rights to your book back?
About 5.
Wow.
So I was in limbo for 5 years, trying to get an attorney, and I have an attorney, a law firm now out of Charleston, and but it 5 years I was delayed, and then I finally got the rights to my book back, and I updated the book, and I didn't have any of my master files, so I basically had to take all of my paperwork and handwritten notes and some of the drafts that I had written up, and I actually worked with a couple other people, and we got the book back together, and I did not go with a publisher. I self-published.
Wow.
I spoke with somebody who advised me, and I did that revised edition book, then the one right here, which is the updated and revised book. And it's all self-published, so I had control over everything.
It's a really good book, folks. If you're into the UFO Enigma, I highly, highly recommend the revised edition. It's really in-depth, more in-depth than probably any UFO book you'll ever read, as far as particular to one case. And one thing that fascinates me too, me and Frank talk 2-3 times a week sometimes, guys. So I'm privy to a lot of stuff. So, but one thing that fascinates me is how you met Stanton Friedman and you guys worked hand in hand. He was able, he's one that aided you quite significantly in some of the government documents you were able to retrieve, right?
Correct. When I started researching the Flatwoods case in the early 90s, I moved to Florida, and I actually went to a Gulf Breeze conference, and that's the first time I met Stanton Friedman, and I met Whitley Strieber at the same time, and I was talking with them, and Dave, I'll never forget, when I met Stanton, I had a customized Flatwoods Monster t-shirt, and I'm walking through the crowd with this shirt on to get some attention, and I went up and I introduced myself to Stanton at his table. And I told him I was researching the project, and his exact words to me, he said, "Frank, how the hell did you get into those mountains with those people?" He said, "We," referring to the UFO community, have been trying to get up there for years, and they just shunned us off.
Yeah.
Just so many people, and I can't blame the people in that area in central West Virginia for batting away all the people. Because first of all, most of the people who investigated this case after Gray Barker and Ivan Sanderson, and some of the early guys were pretty good. They just turned it into a big fairy tale, and they never did any research. What hit the home run for me was getting the Project Blue Book documents out. And Dave, on September 12th, 1952, the Flatwoods Monster incident occurred about 7:30 p.m. That's when it touched down. The incident occurred about a half an hour later at 8. Well, I had the storyline all written up with the Project Blue Book documents. I have countless amounts of articles from all over the United States, all my book references. I have probably everything on planet Earth about the Flatwoods Monster. Well, I had my draft for the book all done, and Stanton Friedman gave me a call, and he says, Frank, I got a little surprise for you. He says, it's in the mail. He sent me down about 5 pounds of paperwork from a private UFO collection, the Barry Greenwood collection. Stanton put in a request, and he had every UFO article ever saved from the Greenwood collection for September 12th and 13th. So I had to rip my master map out, which is behind me right now, and I had to just keep working on it. So Dave, it was like a snowball. Every time I turned around, I was getting hit with more information. It was kind of frustrating opening the book back up. It's like, this book is never going to end. I'm at the point now where I could keep going too, because I've got a lot more information, but I can't keep revising this book every year.
Right. And, during that time, let's talk a minute about, you basically put your whole life on hold, didn't you? Because you put so much time and effort into this case, because like you said, it kept going and going, and you kept uncovering more and more. When was the first time you realized it was a government cover-up? Was it when you talked to Colonel Levitt or Captain Levitt at the time of the incident, and you were able to interview him pretty significantly, weren't you?
Right. What happened is Mrs. May told me about Colonel Levitt. She said Colonel Levitt was up on the farm for basically crowd control. Because, Dave, there were thousands of people up in Flatwoods back at the time. There was about 300 people that lived in the town, and it got trampled. News went around the world basically within a week. And Mrs. May even told me it was this was during the Korean War era. And some of the newspapers, military newspapers, actually carried the story. And Mrs. May told me she was getting phone calls from Japan, from some of the guys who were in the service stationed in Japan. So this went around the world pretty quick. She told me about Colonel Levitt. He was basically there for crowd control, okay? And I said to her, how do I get hold of Colonel Levitt? And Dave, I'll never forget, she says, you're not going to. I'm going to. Let me call him. He doesn't know you. Probably won't talk to you. So Mrs. May called up Colonel Levitt, and the next thing I know, there was a meeting with Levitt, and I went to his house with my cousin, and we sat down and we talked to Colonel Levitt. Shortly thereafter, Colonel Levitt took me onto the farm, onto the Bailey Fisher farm. He would not let me tape him. I just took a notepad and a pen, and I went onto the farm with him for about an hour. And about halfway into the conversation, Colonel Levitt told me he was up there with his troops actually that night. He just wasn't there for crowd control. And I almost stopped dead in my tracks. And I turned and I looked at him. I said, what do you mean? I said, this isn't documented anywhere, and I have everything to do with the monster. And he said they went up there that night, and they did not go up the access road to Depot Street because it was a covert mission. He was up there with about 50, 60 troops that night. He told me he got a call from the Pentagon in Washington, D.C., to gather his troops up and go to Flatwoods. Well, he came in on a back logging road to the north part of the farm as not to disturb. If he went up there with army trucks with 50 to 60 guys, everybody in town would have seen it. So he came up on the backside. He actually came there after the initial reporter, Ailey Stewart. He went up there, and he was the first one to go into the house after the incident. But anyways, Levitt was up there just after midnight, and he took soil samples. There were pieces of little black substance, black graphite type oil all over the farm, and just bits and pieces of different debris. That's when I knew there was a cover-up. Well, he wouldn't let me tape him. So when he let the cat out of the bag, Dave, that's when I became a pain in the neck. Because I pounded that man for, I don't even know, Dave. I would just pop in at his house. I would call him. I was sending him letters. And I've said this a couple times before on the air. It got to the point where I was such a pain in the neck with him. He was either going to talk to me or he was going to shoot me. I wanted his interview, because when he spilled his guts and told me that, I said, I have to get this man on here. I had Kathleen May's interview at that time. And finally, after countless letters and phone calls and popping in, he called me at my cousin's house when I was staying at Frametown, and he said, Frank, I'm ready to talk. Do you have your camera? And I said, yes, Colonel. Everybody called him Colonel. Nobody really called him Dale or Mr. Levitt. And Mrs. May told me that. She says, address him as Colonel. So I came down with my cousin off the mountain in Frametown, and we went over and we picked him up, and we went into Gasaway, and we had breakfast, and we kind of ran over a little bit of what we were going to do. And we left the restaurant and we went up to the farm, and I was armed with the camera. And I had a million questions for him, Dave. And he spilled his guts to me, and he told me everything that happened. Now, here's something too, Dave, because I got his interview right after Mrs. May's, and he was telling me a lot of stuff I didn't know at the time what the hell he was talking about. It didn't make sense to me. But when I started pulling out the Project Blue Book government files, and I started talking to Mrs. May more, talking to the different witnesses, I worked with Freddie, and I started combing through all the newspaper articles, everything started making sense of what had happened. So I had to pull out the master tape of Levitt and watch it over and over. And some of the things, it took me years to find out what he was talking about. He kind of just unloaded and dumped it all on me at once, and I'm like, what's he talking about?
Yeah, folks don't understand how significant that interview was, because you have a commander of a special forces unit who got orders from the Pentagon to get down there to the Flatwoods site because they already knew something went down. They were tracking these objects, and he was willing to finally spill the beans. And what did he tell you at the end? You asked him, you know, was it a cover-up, and what did he tell you?
He said something was a cover-up, and there was something else that had crashed. There was a couple things, and he stood on the farm and he said whatever was here, it could move forward, backwards, or wherever it wanted to. It hovered, because that's what it was. It was a hovercraft machine with an entity inside of it. And that's this Natowski story we could talk about later. But long story short, Levitt walked around the farm with me, and I interviewed him. And like I said, Dave, a lot of it I didn't know what he was talking about, because I was within the first couple of years of my research. But I wanted to get Colonel Levitt because he was getting old, and he still had all his wits about him, and he was sharp. He was telling me about stuff, and he remembered everything. So I talked to him a couple more times after that, and he wrote me a letter back, which I wrote in the book. It was kind of a cool letter, and he died shortly thereafter. So I got him in the nick of time. And that's what Stanton Friedman always said about these cases from the 40s and 50s and 60s. We're racing the Undertaker. That's his famous catchphrase, because we
Yeah.
were. And now Kathleen May has passed away. Freddie May died last year. Stanton passed away a few years ago. It's like everybody is passing away.
Hmm.
And I was lucky, 30 years, I've spent half of my life on this case. And it seems I never got the respect that was due, Dave. I think the Flatwoods case, I was ahead of the curve. Over the past couple of years, when the Flatwoods story had died out, I started getting more calls because of all of these congressional hearings and all these fighter pilots coming out chasing UFOs and Tic Tacs. And in the meantime, I had written another book that was light years ahead and never been done before. Shoot them
Hmm.
down. The Air Force had freestanding orders to shoot flying saucers down in 1952. If you can't talk them down, shoot them down.
Right.
And
And
after
then
that was
people
revealed,
understand what was going on. Tell the listeners and the viewers what was going on in 1952 over the East Coast.
well, 1952, Project Blue Book, who was the investigative organization in charge of UFOs, the Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, there was 1,501 reports. Okay, that was total. Okay, during the summer of 1952 alone, Dave, there were between June, July, August, and September 1,134 reports of total 1,500. So there was a lot going on that summer, and that was the time when we had the back-to-back weekends in the end of July at the Washington, D.C. sightings. And then there was an announcement that about that if you can't talk them down, shoot them down. And the UFOs were being chased, and there were intercept attempts virtually every day, not just over the United States, but throughout the world, because the Air Force had
And
other bases.
those brave pilots, so many of them were lost, and they labeled them as training accidents, correct? And a lot of the guys, they didn't even act like they ever existed, and you wrote about that in your book as well.
Well, on September 12th, 52, right before the Flatwoods Monster incident happened. Now, Dave, what nobody ever picked up on, there was a UFO flap on September 12th that was 21 hours long. From the first sighting of the day and up until the Flatwoods encounter, which was at the end of the story, there was actually a sightings right up till almost the end of that night. It was just like the country was overwhelmed with UFOs for 21 hours. The United States Air Force said the explanation was one fireball meteor that was seen for approximately 7 seconds.
Yeah.
When I started tracking this down, I was able to establish there was actually 25 UFOs seen over the mid-Atlantic area over 10 states. And there were 4 damaged
Yeah.
UFOs that came in that night.
So just pick it up right there and tell the whole story from there on. I mean, that's where it makes sense and people will understand. People know the initial sighting, but fill them in on what was actually going on that night and what you figured out after all these years of investigating and researching.
Well, like I said earlier, I knew the Flatwoods story had to have a beginning, a middle, and an end. And it was at the point where I knew there was a cover-up, because after I spoke to Colonel Levitt with his interview, I had spoke to Mrs. May at a later time, and I showed her the Project Blue Book documents. And it was like every time I spoke to Kathleen, I would jog her memory, and she would tell me something else. And she was actually getting stuff mailed to her at her home from all over the world, and she would give it to me. She said, "Here, Frank, maybe this will aid in your research." So I'm accumulating this massive data. And at that point, she said, "I want to tell you about what happened to me up on the farm shortly after the incident happened." She was approached by 2 men now this ties into what Levitt with the cover up. She told me she was approached by two men who said they were newspaper reporters from West Virginia. I believe she said Clarksburg was one of them. And they were not actually newspaper reporters. They were basically, for a lack of a better term, they were the men in black. They were intelligence agents. Mrs. May wanted nothing to do with them. At that point, there's hundreds and hundreds of people going onto that farm. Colonel Levitt was there for crowd control, and it was just mass craziness of what that town was going through. The Braxton Democrat was the headquarters for all the reporters that came into Braxton County. Well, Mrs. May told me she wanted nothing to do with these guys. Well, they came back the next day, and they started probing her again, and they said, Mrs. May, we are actually from the United States government. We would like to ask you some questions. Now, at this point, she told me they kind of stuck out like sore thumbs, because they were in there with their $500 suits, their beautiful hats, ties, and shoes, and they really didn't fit in to that area in 1952. She said she went up onto the farm with Freddie, and she stood there, and she was talking to one of the men, and he was hammering her with questions, and she pointed up to the tree area where the monster was seen, where it was hiding behind when the encounter occurred. And the guy was poking around up there, and he came back about 10, 15 minutes later, and I'll never forget, it was funny. I was in Mrs. May's condo, and she was sitting in her easy chair, and she started cracking up, Dave. She said, that guy came back. She said his beautiful suit was covered in gray-black oil from where the monster was leaking up there from a couple days before. The initial oil that leaked onto the ground was picked up by Colonel Levitt. He grabbed all that stuff up. They put it in containers, and he said we shipped it off to Washington. Well, this machine was leaking some type of an oil, and it splattered throughout the nearby woods. And when this intelligence agent was walking through the woods, all this stuff got on him, and Mrs. May was laughing. She said he looked like a zebra because when all of this oil was on the branches, he was walking through it, and it completely ruined his suit. Now, here's the cool part, Dave. Mrs. May said she remembers what he said to his partner. He held his arms out at his side, and he said, I wonder what Ed's going to think about this when we send this in for analysis, referencing his suit. And Mrs. May said he was covered and he was dripping oil. And I almost fell over when she told me Ed. Because I knew who Ed was. Edward J. Ruppelt. He was the head of Project Blue Book. These guys were Project Blue Book, and they were sent down on a covert mission. And that was actually verified in the early 50s in Donald Kehoe's book. Donald Kehoe was one of the pioneer investigators, and he took a liking to this Flatwoods case, and he was calling up and hounding the boys at the Pentagon about this. And he said later on, from a source outside of the Pentagon, I spoke to people who said they did not send in people waving flags going on from the government because it would have looked too obvious, like the Air Force was really taking this whole thing serious, because they were writing it off as a joke. And later on, they wrote it off as being probably what the people saw was an owl perched up on a branch 12 feet in the air, and they saw the glowing eyes, and the body was probably that of the underbrush. And they're
that's ridiculous. That's a ridiculous statement, because people from West Virginia are woods people, and they hunt, fish. They know every animal in the woods. They know what they're looking at. They're not going to make up some kind of cockamamie story like that. They knew that what they saw, was something extraordinary.
Oh, absolutely. And even when when I was first starting this, Dave, and I was reading all these ridiculous stories, and then I saw what the monster looked like, the drawing, and the first publication and the Charleston Gazette was on September 15th, and it called the Flatwoods Monster a mechanical man, and it gave a correct description of it. And the reason there was a correct description of it is because Ailey Stewart, who was the writer for the Braxton Democrat, he's the one that told the information to the Gazette. He was actually the first person of authority up there that night shortly after the incident happened. The state police were out running around. They were unavailable. The local sheriff's department was busy. They were out looking for what was said to be an airplane crash. And
Yeah.
there was nobody to respond to the call.
So they broke up the military unit into two groups, right? Colonel Leverage
Right.
came up on the back road, and the other group was down there searching for the so-called aircraft, almost as a cover story.
Right, in the Sugar Creek area. But it was another damaged craft. I tracked it coming into the area, and what I did, Dave, is I was getting all the local newspapers. I was able to establish the flight paths of 4 damaged objects and 25 different craft that were seen that night. And what I did, Dave, is during this time, I did illustrations, and my house looked like a Flatwoods Monster Museum. And just for instance, I'm going to show you a couple of the illustrations. These have never been seen before, Dave. These are the different objects that were seen that night. You got a lock on that?
Yeah.
I can see it.
And what I did is, this is the
look at
Flatwoods
that.
ship. It was called the Flame over Washington. It passed over Washington about 7 o'clock, and it flew 206 miles west, and it went into Upper Braxton County over heaters, turned south, and it landed in Flatwoods on the farm. And this is the painting I did from Freddie May's description of the craft that landed up in the far back of the farm. I don't know if you could see that clear, but
Yeah.
it touched down on the back of the Bailey Fisher farm. And by working with all the witnesses, I was able to establish what this craft looked like. I also worked with another man who really helped me out. His name was Jack Davis.
Oh,
And
yeah.
up until the point that Jack Davis passed away, he was like my tour guide, because Mrs. May was older, Freddie May was working, and I didn't know the area for beans. So what happened is Jack was retired, and I would go over with my buddy, and we would pick Jack up. He showed me every inch of Braxton County, and he took me to all the landmarks.
Frank, tell the viewers who Jack Davis is so they know. So
Jack Davis was an adult witness who actually saw the craft fly over Flatwoods that night. The group of
Freddie May and the original 7 or 8 people that saw it, right?
the
He had
original
a
kid,
viewpoint.
right. He was driving his car back home, and he saw this thing. Well, he was over on the side of the road, but he saw the craft go over, and he saw it from a different point. The boys saw it from one area down by the main town on the school playground, and Jack Davis saw it from another point of town, and he gave me his description of what it looked like in explicit detail. And he saw it coming over, slowing down, and he said, the thing that I saw, it was on fire. It had flames coming off of it, and he thought it was an airplane going down. He says, but it did not look like the airplanes you would see in this area at that time until the thing got closer, and he got closer to it, and he noticed it was like an oval shape. It was almost like shaped like a football. And it stopped in midair and tilted and dropped to the ground. Now, when it dropped to the ground, Jack said he could see where it landed through the trees, and it landed on the plateau of the mountaintop. And what was interesting, one time I was up there with Jack, and he says, I'm going to show you another vantage point. I want you to look at something. And I'm driving through the mountains. I had no idea where I was going. And Jack pulled over on the side of the road. He says, okay, he says, we're going to go hiking for a few minutes. And we walked across this big, gigantic field. And he says, look out across the mountain range. He says, what do you see out there? And Dave, right in the middle of the mountain range, it looked like a big bald spot on a man's head. And he said, that's where it touched down. This thing just didn't happen to crash land. When you see where the mountains are, it touched down on that plateau of that clearing of the field in the back. And that gave me a better idea of what was going on, and I can overlook the school playground. So Jack drove me around, or I drove him around for years. And Jack owned an auto repair shop. And I was talking to him one day before we went out on our venture, and I said, Jack, I said, how big was the craft that you saw? I want to have an idea, because you saw it a little bit closer than what the kids saw. His garage, Dave, the bays were not side by side. They weren't like this. They were end-to-end bays. Have you ever seen that? The bays were end-to-end with the lifts. And we were standing there in the shop, and he said a little bit bigger than the end-to-end of both of these bays. And that was about 36 to 38 feet. And the thing was about approximately 18 to 20 foot. So it was a big, giant oval, approximately 36, 38.
That's a good sized craft there.
Right. That's why he said at first when he saw it and it had the flames shooting off of it, he thought it was an airplane. He says, but then when he got a lock and a fix on it, he said it wasn't an airplane. The thing didn't have any wings. And then it stopped in midair and it dropped. And when it dropped behind the tree line, he said that it lit up the whole area up there. It was pulsing, and he says it looked like a luminous light.
It made controlled maneuvers to land, basically.
Oh, absolutely. It stopped dead in the air. It came across, stopped, tilted, and it dropped to the ground. The boys saw that. Jack had a clearer vantage point of it. And I did sketches with him of what it looked like, and I wrote, there's a portion in the book about his description. But I had a lot of help, a lot of people, Dave. I was actually, when I was writing the book over the years, every different point throughout Braxton County, I reenacted what Sheriff Carr, where he drove and what he did that night. And I clocked myself. I took notes, because the roads are basically back when I was doing this in the 90s. The roads hadn't changed. They were basically the same as in the 50s. So I was able to establish a timeline through what actually happened within minutes of that whole night.
So, and there's more to the story, right? I mean, you want to talk about George and Edith Natowski real quick and tell what happened after the original night, the original incident?
Well, after the Flatwoods monster incident on the farm, what happened is the monster hovered back towards its craft. What happened, when Jack saw this thing land, he said it was glowing. It was luminescent and it was pulsing. He said you could see the light through the trees, and it was starting to get dark, so it stood out like a sore thumb. So the pilot of this thing, logically speaking, you don't want to sit on a mountaintop where you just went down, your craft was in flames, now you're touched down, everybody can see it. So what the craft did is it hovered off of that plateau into the valley of the farm. It was up here, it lifted and dropped, and it hid in the valley of the second pasture of the farm, where it was less conspicuous. When the so-called monster departed its craft, it hovered across the field, hid up behind the tree, and that's when Mrs. May and the boys encountered it. Well, it left and it departed, and it followed its tracks. because the bottom of this thing, the propulsion system, Freddie and Kathleen said it was about four to a little over 4 foot wide at the base, which is down here. It was about 4 feet across here, about 3 feet up here, and it was about 10 to 12 feet. And Colonel Levitt told me they gauged the height of it because there was a branch that came down, and you could see in back of me, there's a picture of what's left of the tree. That's how they were able to gauge the height. Levitt said they took measurements, and that's when he said this thing, when it hovered out, it just about had enough of room, and this thing had blown the grass through the path, and it followed it back like walking through the snow. You walk up and you follow your footprints back. It followed its footprint back. When it got into the craft, it lifted off and departed the farm. Well, I didn't know where it went after that. Well, I started talking to more people up there who actually saw the craft, and it followed the Elk River. Then I was following the little local newspapers, and there were sightings, and what that thing actually did is it flew about 17 miles away, and it landed on James Knoll in Frametown, and that's where it touched down. The following night, 24 hours later, now Kathleen May and the boys saw the Flatwoods Monster about 8 o'clock that night, approximately. When that thing took off and all was said and done, it was probably about 15 minutes later the thing took off. And some of the local Flatwoods residents saw it taking off. Well, it headed down the Elk River and it landed on James Knoll. And that's right, in the area, in the vicinity of State Route 4. Well, at that point, it dropped out of sight. Nobody knows what happened. Well, 24 hours later, on September 13th, there was a couple from New York. They went into Ohio on a vacation, and on the way back, they decided to take the scenic route, and they wanted to drive through the mountains, George and Eva Snatowski. Well, they had their young baby in the back seat. Back then, they didn't have baby seats. The baby was in a crib, and their car stalled, and the engine went dead on the side of the road. And George Snatowski thought that there was a factory nearby that was on fire, and he smelled this sulfur smell, which is the same type of smell that was noted by Mrs. May and the witnesses. They got sick from it. Some of the boys were throwing up. It was like rotten eggs, sulfur, and it was like a burning smell. Well, Snatowski noted the same thing. He got out to fix his car, and he was checking out the battery. He jumped out. The smell is engulfing the area. The baby's going hysterical. His wife's going crazy because they don't know what's going on. They're stuck out there in the middle of nowheres in the darkness with a dead car. They have no idea what happened the night before because it hadn't hit the newspapers until Sunday. And then Monday is when it was released in a shotgun around the country. Well, what happened is George got out, he popped the hood on his car, and he's checking the battery out. Didn't start. Car's dead. This smell is starting to engulf the car. It's getting worse. He goes over to check on his wife and the baby, rolls the windows up, to stop these fumes. It was like a misty fume that was permeating through the area. He starts walking out, and he sees something hovering out in the far woods. And it was kind of like bobbing up and down. And it was a big spheroid. And it had like a purplish glow to it. The same thing that was noted by Mrs. May the night before. She saw purplish glow up on the farm when they were en route to going up there. So we have these similarities between the Flatwoods case and this case. Well, George Snatowski starts walking towards the sphere to see what it is. And as he starts getting closer to it, he starts getting these low vibrational electric shocks, like thousands of needles piercing his skin. and he had to back away from this thing. It was putting out some type of an electrical discharge. He starts walking back towards the car, and the smell is getting worse, and he drops to his knees and he starts vomiting. Well, as he's vomiting, he gets back up. He's walking back towards the car, and his wife starts screaming bloody murder. She was like when Fay Ray saw King Kong on Skull Island. She went hysterical, screaming, "George, look out, it's behind you." Well, George turned around, and he looked off to the side of the road, and there is this 9-foot-tall being hovering, and the upper torso of it was actually looked like a snake reptilian creature with long spindly arms and 2 fingers. And it was hovering across the road, just like this thing was seen, except when Snatowski saw it, this portion and the upper portion were off. Okay?
Mm-hmm.
This thing was actually a spacesuit. And George saw the lower half of this with the pipes, and down here was the exhaust. That's where the exhaust fumes were coming out. That's what made them sick. And George said it was a good 9 feet tall. The Flatwoods Monster was said to be about 12 foot tall. So you take this 3-foot Ace of Spades helmet. This was actually an inner helmet, Dave. Okay,
Yeah.
This was outer protection. Freddie May and Mrs. May said it had like a glass covering here. Freddie told me what this thing actually looked like was like the cockpit of a fighter jet. Okay, this is the canopy, the helmet in the inside. The pilot's got his helmet on with his goggles. That's basically what this was.
Yeah. So it had like an inner helmet and an outer helmet. It was just missing the upper portion that the Mays and Kathleen and all them saw. This time, this family saw it without the upper portion on it. So, and then the bottom portion was the same description. So it makes perfect sense.
Right. And this thing followed him back to the car. Okay. His wife's going crazy. She had grabbed the baby out of the back. It was a boy. Pulled him onto her lap into the front seat. Now, it was a 50s car. Has a big, for those of you who know the big old 50s cars, it had a big area in the front. And underneath, there was a big area underneath the glove box. When George got in there, he grabbed her. He pushed her down on the ground with the baby. And he reached in and he got a big hunting knife, a big blade. Natural instinct, the guy's going to protect his wife and child, and he laid over the top of them holding the knife. And at that point, he said, if I ever prayed in my life, I was praying now. He says, my heart was beating like a hammer. He was freaked out seeing this thing. Well, he didn't know what happened to her because he's hiding down on the floor. And this thing had circled around the car, and after a few minutes, he wanted to see what was going on, and he lifted his head up from the dashboard and looked over, and the damn thing was staring down at him from the front of the car. How scary is that, Dave? I think that was as scary as the Flatwoods case. And the thing, I actually spoke to George Santowski on the phone, and you have, I believe, the original article too. Well, there was an article from a magazine called Mail Magazine. It was like sport and hunting and, you know, like current events of the day. And the original article was written by Paul Lieb, who interviewed him. Now, I had only read a couple little pieces about this Frametown incident, but when I found this magazine in the early 90s, that's when I contacted Satowski. I wanted to know if this was a true story, if it was a bunch of crap, just a fictional story that was written. Well, when I called, his wife actually answered the phone. I had somebody get me their private number. It was kind of a shock to him after all of those years. Here it is. It was at that point about 40 years later.
let me stop you there real quick, because why? He never wanted to talk about that again after he gave the initial interview, right?
That's correct. He said he went through hell and he caught a lot of flack, and he was a businessman. He worked for a big company, and he said he was just made a fool out of. And he says, I'll tell you a few things about it, and it is true. He said that did absolutely happen, but I wanted to know a little bit more details of what this thing looked like. And it looked like some type of a reptilian snake. Not a reptilian like the Gorn as it's portrayed in Star Trek with the big T-Rex face. It was basically like a snake face.
Which, I think the listeners need to understand that's very significant for Frank to be, because Frank is the only other people that was able to talk to Mr. Sandotowsky about his eyewitness interview. He gave him basically gave him the only other interview besides what was in the magazine back from those days. So Frank is the only person to ever talk to him and get information out of him. So it's very important.
I wanted to make sure it was true. I wanted to make sure it wasn't a fictionalized story that was just written up. But, he verified it. He told me about the interview. He says, what was in there, what I told Paul Lieb, he said is correct. Well, I wanted to know a few more details about what it looked like. Like, the arms were disjointed. The thing had 2 fingers. And it was a long, spindly arm. Now, here's the crazy part, Dave. When this thing was in front of the car, and it's hovering up and down, and it looked down on him, he said it reached out with its long, forked fingers, and when it touched the hood of the car, it actually burnt through the paint.
Wow.
And,
it was almost like it was probably a mechanical device that was being controlled the arm. I mean, I would venture to guess it would make sense that the creature,
either that or some type of a body acid. We don't know what the thing was secreting. We don't know. And he noticed it later on, but a lot of people have asked me, well, why didn't he go public and take pictures of it? He really didn't want nothing to do with this thing off the bat. His article didn't come out until 3 years later. This happened in 52, and he told this story, wanted to get it off his chest in 1955. And then that's when he told me on the phone he kind of regretted even doing it. He says, I'm not going to go through this.
Because of the ridicule that people were put through by the actual false cover-up stories by the government, and then the locals would rib and ridicule folks thinking they were crazy,
Yeah, and the thing is, Dave, he didn't know about the Flatwoods case when that happened that night, because like I said, it hadn't hit the press. Flatwoods happened on Friday night. This happened on Saturday night. What came out in the Saturday papers was all of the meteors and UFOs, the flying saucers that were seen. The Flatwoods story didn't hit. It made one paper on Sunday the 14th, then it hit mainstream on Monday, September 15th, and that's when it shotgun and it was all over the United States, and then it was even in Japan. But he didn't know about it at that point, and nobody ever put 2 and 2 together. They just thought this was a ridiculous-ass case, but nobody ever tied it together with Flatwoods. And after that thing touched the hood of the car, it hovered back off into the woods and disappeared. And a few minutes later, he saw that oval-shaped craft make a swinging pendulum motion, which is not uncommon because there was a lot of UFOs seen back in the 50s that did that. And he said it kept going like this, and it just took off like a bat out of hell and disappeared. And within a couple minutes after it disappeared, he was able to start the car up. And,
which goes along with a lot of reports of UFO encounters when people are driving in cars, their cars just shut off, all the electronics, everything shuts off.
Safe.
I mean, that happened, that's been reported hundreds of times by experiencers and stuff. So in your personal opinion, we've talked about it. I know what your opinion is, but we need the viewers to know. This was some sort of rescue mission, correct? Is that what you believe?
What I figured out by using my master map and all the articles, putting everything together. As you can see, that these are on my website, and this actual map behind me, Dave, has 116 pinpointed locations where I have documented sightings. A good chunk of them actually came out of Project Blue Book. And what I did for years is just plot all the points on this map and piece it together. And what I discovered is there were 4 damaged UFOs that came over the United States that night. And if you could see here, they all connect off the East Coast up to this side, and they form an apex. 3 damaged objects came in. The first one headed southwest, and it actually flew 105 miles to the no-fly zone at Oak Ridge National Laboratory, which was involved in the Manhattan Project and the development of the atomic bombs. Not too cool for a UFO damage.
Yeah, that just doesn't happen.
No, not through the no-fly zone.
No.
The second object flew northwest in the opposite direction, and it made a beeline and went directly at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, Research and Development, and it was making a beeline for that area. And if you look on the map, you'll see that they are situated right above. Wright-Patterson is up here, and if you look the way it's situated, Oak Ridge is down there. So you have 2 objects gunning for 2 military facilities. The third object that came in over the eastern seaboard was actually the Flatwoods Monster craft. That's what was called the Flame over Washington, and that's heavily documented in the Project Blue Book case files. And it was also in the Washington papers, and it was in a couple other papers. It flew extremely low and basically at treetop level. It was flying up and down, and it was damaged. It had pieces coming off of it.
Why do craft do that? Because they want to avoid what? Radar.
And back then, the radar was 5,000 feet. So once those craft dipped under 5,000 feet, they lost track of them.
Yeah.
The other damaged object came in from the direction of Florida, and that's where we have the missing pilot, John Anderson Jones Jr. and John Del Curto. They were out on what was said to be a routine training mission, and they vanished into thin air. Well, when I found out about this story, Dave, this happened right before the Flatwoods incident happened. And what I write about is there had to be a reason that 4 craft came in, one after another, within minutes. And when you connect the dots and bring them off the East Coast, they all intercept over the Atlantic Ocean ADIZ zone, which is the Air Defense Intelligence Zone, where you have to identify yourself. Now, back then during the Cold War, the United States was not fooling around. They were scrambling jets out, and there was the orders to shoot them down if you can't talk them down. So here you have 3 damaged objects coming in over the eastern seaboard, and they're all gunning for these facilities. The third one that comes in made a beeline and flew over Washington, flew over Virginia, and it flew about 206 miles west, hit upper Braxton County over Burnsville, and then it turned south. And it came down, it was seen over heaters. It actually followed the road, and it was flying between the mountains. You live there, you know what the mountains are like. This thing was threading a needle and flying between the mountain just to not collide with it. The thing was erratic. Pieces are falling off of it. And that's when the boys saw it in the school playground, and Jack Davis, and the thing had touched down. Well, a long story short is this is why it took about 25 years to figure out. The Flatwoods Monster incident was actually a rescue mission. I worked with military personnel I worked with pilots, air traffic controllers. I worked with the guys who were Marines. They were in World War II, Korea, and Nam. And they worked with me putting this together. I don't claim all the glory for this. When it came to the military part, Dave, I had help because I didn't want to goof the story up. And I was having trouble figuring out what happened
Mm-hmm.
until one guy in particular stood in front of this map behind me and he went, "Oh my God, Frank, do you know what you have here?" I says, "I have some sort of an idea." And he just
Wow.
started blurting out. And he was a military expert. And he said, "They think like we do." Or he said, "We think, the opposite way around. Not like we think like them. They were thinking like us." He said, "Well, whatever happened, our strategies were the same." He said, "They came in looking for this thing."
Yeah.
And what happened is what drove Gray Barker and Sanderson nuts is they couldn't figure out why, if the Flatwoods monster craft was oval shaped, why were there craft that were coming in that were shaped like bells? Why were some round? Why were some oval? There was two rocket shaped, cigar shaped objects that came looking in. That's because they came in looking for it and they
Mm-hmm.
missed the rendezvous. There was all these sightings over that one hilltop, which is the size of a football field. They were flying all over there looking for it. One of them that crashed down the river was another one that was supposed to rendezvous. That's where Colonel Levitt went. All this was, Dave, was connecting the dots in a 25-year jigsaw puzzle. People are
Hey,
still sending me articles. I got two more articles where I'm filling in the dots of what happened.
hey, Frank.
And then one of the craft went all the way to Florida, and then Stanton was able to help you get a blue book piece of evidence that connected it with the Flatwoods incident, correct?
Right. Well, when the pilots disappeared over the Gulf of Mexico or Florida, I
Mm-hmm.
tracked a UFO from the south, and it's right behind me. You could see it. It was all the way from the south, and that was one of the damaged crafts that flew and actually went into Braxton County. What they were doing, Dave, is trying to get the damaged objects in the same place, get them together so you don't have
Mm-hmm.
them all over the country. The one that actually flew up towards Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, when the third object passed over Washington, it wasn't intercepted, which it very well should have been. It flew over the Capitol. They backed off on it because they had two going in the other direction. What would have happened if that thing had decided to kamikaze into Oak Ridge?
Right.
That
Yeah.
would have been a disaster. And if the other one had landed or crashed into Wright-Patterson, when the third object flew over Washington and was not intercepted, the other two turned away and went back in the opposite direction, Dave. I don't know if you could see it on the map, but the one that went to Wright-Pat actually turned and went towards the Wheeling Panhandle and nearly collided with a passenger plane. And
Oh,
I
yeah.
tracked it from Wheeling coming down and to the area of Vineyard Hills, and that's where you have the Bashful Billy story. You're familiar with that,
Yep.
okay? I tracked the craft. It landed in that area, and the cover story was said to be a badly burned body of a woman. They
Right.
dropped that alien off, Dave. It was damaged. It was hurt. They dropped it off there, and then I picked it up and followed it all the way through West Virginia, going into the Charleston area, crashing and landing, exploding, pieces coming off of it, and it finally exited and went back out of the southern United States. So this thing that's why it took 25 years figuring this damn thing out, because
This
there
was
was
like a
so
week.
many sightings.
How many days did all this occur in overall?
One day, 21 hours.
Yeah.
Wow.
The
Well,
hub of it all
all the way
occurred
to back
within
Billy.
the hub of it occurred within 1 hour when they all came in damaged over the eastern seaboard,
Mhm.
over the mid-Atlantic.
But you
And
had
all of
the
this was
original
said to be one meteor.
Yeah.
Therefore, said it was a fireball meteor.
So you had the Flatwoods incident on the 12th. The next night you had the George and Edith Santowski case. Then you had the Bashful Billy, which was on what day?
That was on the night of the Flatwoods incident, but it didn't
Right.
hit the
So,
papers until later.
and that was a known cover up in the Parkersburg area too. So, you know,
Yep.
it all lines up. You know, it's fascinating stuff. So I'm
Okay.
done with my questions, Noreen. You go ahead.
Hey, I just have one question. Um, was there any ever sounds coming from this mechanical monster? Did they make sounds? What was the sound?
Mrs. May told me as she neared the tree, see, they couldn't see it. You could see this tree behind me that I'm standing next to. I'm standing right on the location where that was actually located. Dave, that's why I glow when the lights shut off. That's the exact location where the monster was seen. Well, when Mrs. May approached the tree, she had noticed, she said it was like a thumping noise. And she described it as like taking a coin on a piece of stretched canvas, almost like a drum, like a thump, 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 thump. And then there was some type of a hissing noise she heard. Well, what I believe the hissing noise was the release of the gas, because Colonel Levitt told me this thing was sitting down. Because where it was sitting behind the tree, Levitt got all the oil in the perimeter. He gathered all that up. This thing lifted off the ground and hovered and moved down in front of the witnesses. And that's when Mrs. May got hit with the oil. She got splattered by it, and in the meantime, they all inhaled this gas on top of it.
Okay.
And then
But those were the noises that she heard.
So having done all this research and everything, I got one more question for you. Did you ever have any weird run-ins with what you thought were government agents trying to stifle what you were doing or anything of that sort over the years of doing this?
When my first, before my first book came out, I got a call from Washington when I had my, I sent in the paper form, which was like this thick. I sent it in for copyright, and I got a call, and the man said he was from the Library of Congress. And I said, how come it's taking so long for me to get a copyright on this book? And he said, well, I got to answer, you answer the questions, I'm going to ask them. And I'm like, well, what's this about? And he said, quote unquote, we passed your manuscript around Washington here, and we would like to know if you're going to investigate the Flatwoods Monster case any further, end quote. And I could remember it like it was yesterday. And that's when I said, who is this? The Library of Congress? And he said, yes. Are you going to further your investigation into this case? I took notes and wrote it down what he said. That's how I can say it verbatim. Well, anyways, I said no. I says, I'm not going to. 5 days later, I got my copyright in the mail.
Mm-hmm. That was like a little innuendo to stop what you're doing, or you're not going to get copyright, and we're going to go after you probably.
Wow.
Well, then I called Stanton Friedman up. And Stanton said, what's in that book, Frank? He says, what's the key point in that book? He says, they're asking you questions about furthering your research. I said, it probably is Colonel Dale Levitt spilled his guts to me and told me what happened, how it was a covert mission, which he did, which you can read about in the book. And at that point, Stanton said to me, he said, I want to read that manuscript. He says, I want to know what made them nervous. He said, this has got to be a good case, Frank, if you got a call like that. Here's something else that Stanton said to me. And Dave, this is the honest to God's truth. Stanton had a dual citizenship. He lived in America and he Holton, Maine, and then he lived in Canada. And he said, that country that you live in, the United States, isn't as free as you think it is. That's what he told me.
Yeah.
He says, I want to read that manuscript. And I says, well, I'll get it to you. And he said, Frank, do you know, he says, how this whole operation works with sending books in? He said, what's the name of your book? I said, the Braxton County Monster, the cover up of the Flatwoods Monster Reveal. And Stanton had that low bellowing laugh. And he just started laughing, hysterical. He says, well, what the hell do you think? He says, when I came across the conveyor belt and they were looking at the books, he says, of course that title is going to jump out. He says, you can't just write any crazy-ass book and, you know, certain things you can't write about are sensitive. He says, and they pulled that book and he told you, we passed it around Washington here. I want to know if you're going to further investigation any further. So I sent Stanton the manuscript, and from that point forward, it was just, we started working together.
Wow.
And I couldn't have done it without Stanton, because he was right there for me. God bless his soul right now. It's been a few years since he passed away. But he's another one that has the patience of a saint, because I drove him nuts, Dave, for years. I made hundreds and hundreds of phone calls to him, and every time I found a piece of material, I would call him, I would send him a fax, I would send him a JPEG through email, and he did the same thing with me. I had to rewrite the whole draft of one of my books over again because he sent me that big heavy box with all the information in it. I'm like, oh my God. It took about another year of pulling my book apart and inserting all the information he gave me.
Yeah.
And it happened again. So it's just like the never-ending story of Flatwoods.
Wow.
So hopefully it's getting a little bit more attention and respect now, and not how everybody keeps writing about this thing, how it was a monster in claws. This thing was a mechanical device, and what Freddie and Kathleen had actually said, something was inside of it. It wasn't alive, but something in it.
Bottom line is, too, Norene, you know, no one had, you know, there's so many people out there that regurgitate other people's information, and lots of people have taken Frank's information and used it like it's their own, you know. And
I know.
the thing is, no one had the connections that Frank did on this case, or the relationships with the original eyewitnesses that Frank did. And anyone out there that's claiming they have, you know, they know the real story, or they know this, or they know that, they're full of it, straight up full of it. Frank's been there for many, many years, you know, and people need to understand that. So, you know, I just want to make that point clear, because he's the man when it comes to the Flatwoods Monster case, always has been, and no one has come close to putting in any time that he put in to this case.
Well, I've already talked to you about that, Dave. About a couple of people we know that are doing that. They just can't stand the thought that somebody like Frank is around that has all the information. Hey, I have somebody has a question. Let me do let me pull this in here. I'm showing the. It's from you. Okay, so it has the metal body and then red at the top, like a helmet inside, and then the beam that's shooting out from it. What's that beam of light, do you think, coming out of that red innard?
This whole monster was some type of a mechanical device. Like I told you earlier, what Freddie May had said to me, it was like looking in the cockpit of a jet with the inner helmet being a fighter pilot's eyes over the head. Well, the eyes weren't eyeballs, they were portholes, okay? And how Freddie described it to me is when you jump into your car at night, okay, and it's dark, you turn the ignition on, or you press out, or you start your car up, and the dashboard lights glow and all come on. Well, what happened is when Mrs. May approached this thing and she hit it with the beam of her flashlight, the thing lit up from the outside and it glowed like starting your car up with the ignition, and the whole interior lit up, and the beams that shot out were the lights that were encased inside and actually forced out. They weren't killer laser beams from a science fiction 50s movie. They were just beams of light that shot out when the interior lit up.
So this thing, it's mechanical. There's no alien inside of it. It's just a mechanic.
No. There you go.
Yeah. Okay. Well, let me go to that. I have that. That's the frame
Right.
one. Okay. Let me go to the Frame Town Monster. Okay. So I have. Okay. So I'm showing the one that you just held up. The bottom
Okay.
part. So the half of it, the metal is off. So it's exposing. Is that an alien or is that also mechanical?
That's an alien.
So that's an
the
alien.
That's the flesh and blood.
Creature
See
that's
that?
inside the suit.
Okay.
The upper half of the suit is removed.
Sort
What
of.
George Satowski saw was the monster inside of the suit with the upper portion removed, like if you took your fighter helmet off or you took your astronaut suit off and took the other half off, but this thing was hovering around. When he saw it, the upper half and the helmet was gone, but when Mrs. May and the boys saw it, everything was on top of it. This was gone, the outer helmet and the inner helmet were all off. Snatowski saw this with the being actually the flesh and blood being inside of it.
So
It was like a rip.
yeah, that's really weird.
Yeah, like a snake reptilian type thing.
Okay, so when they saw this, how close were they to this thing that they saw?
He came within a few feet of it. It chased him back to the car.
It chased him?
It followed him back to the car.
But he was hoovering. He didn't walk, he was hoovering. Floating.
Right. That thing is a mechanical device. The pipes, what happened, Dave, is when the sketch artist did the drawing for We the People, Mrs. May was describing the lower half of it. She had never seen anything like this. In West Virginia, 1952, there was only a handful of cars and a handful of radios. You know, then you see something that looks like this. She was describing to the sketch artist the lower portion of it. These flanged out pipes were part of the propulsion system. This is where the gas came out.
Oh, gotcha.
Well, Mrs. May is describing to the sketch artist. She said these, which were the pipes, reminded her of the drapes hanging in her living room.
Right.
The pleats. So the guy put it in a dress. He took her description literally.
I know.
She's trying, from her life experience, trying to give this guy a sketch. Well, he drew it in a dress. When she said it had an Ace of Spades covering over the top, he drew a cloaked upper portion, like a monk's outfit. And these antennas was actually, they look like little hands.
Yeah,
They
I'm
were
showing
some type
that.
of an antenna device. So the sketch artist drew, instead of antennas, he drew arms and claws to make this thing look scary.
People had no words to describe what they had nothing to reference it to, Noreen.
Exactly.
God. So when this thing chased that man, what happened? Did he go into his car and he get away, or?
Yeah, that's when he jumped into the car and he pushed his wife down onto the passenger side floor, reached in and grabbed a knife, and he was hovering over him. When he got into the car and he crouched down, he was underneath the dashboard.
Oh, okay.
He didn't know where it was. After a minute or two, he lifted his head up to look above the dashboard, and that's when he saw this thing looking down at him. A scary looking thing.
How long did that last?
That's looking down at him 9 feet tall. And it's still bellowing out all the gas and everything. And it was just momentarily, it reached down and it touched the hood of the car.
Oh, and
And
then,
that's when it
yeah.
burned the hood of the car. It backed off, and then it took back off into the woods, and it headed back towards that sphere that George initially had seen
Wow.
floating.
For several minutes. That went on for quite some time. I mean, if you think about, he got out to check the battery.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, so
Right.
that wasn't just a few minute thing. That lasted for several minutes, I would say.
Oh my God.
Yeah, and
It's a
that was
story, man. The whole thing is fascinating.
Oh, it is. It is. Dave, I've been fascinated with this ever since you introduced it to me a couple years ago. Holy cow, I still can't get over it.
Yeah, then when I told her, Frank, I said, well, get this. I said, I've been talking to the man, the myth, the legend on Flatwoods, and I said, you should have him on your show, right? And she was so ecstatic, she didn't know what to say. So, yeah, it's an honor for me to be able to be privy. And Frank's got a lot of information he's never released. He's saving it for the right opportunity, too. So there's more to come on the Flatwoods Monster case, believe you me.
Well,
But
Frank,
this Dave, this picture hasn't been seen. I think I got one shot in the book, but it's a black and white. Here's Colonel Levitt, United States Army. Here's Colonel Levitt with me in the field. Can you see that?
mm-hmm,
Yeah.
And there I am interviewing him on camera.
Yep.
Wow.
The
And you
only
got-
interview in existence.
And Frank's told me, he's got just countless amounts of interviews with the Mays and everybody that he's never released yet. So,
Yeah.
exciting.
Notes, interviews, cutaway shots, Dave. It's humble. I could have 10 books. We could do a mini-series. Maybe we will do a mini-series, Norene. We can keep talking. We haven't even touched on the story of the encounter on the farm and how it happened. There was so much to talk about this story.
Well, wait a
And,
minute. So how come you sent me 11 questions to read to you? Well, how come you didn't include any of those questions in there? That's another show. With Dave. Well, we got 11 questions, Dave, that Frank sent to me. Some of it has been covered, but I think we'll go over it anyway because it's so fascinating. Do you want? Can I start? Do you want? It's okay. And Dave, after each.
I did my questions.
Okay, but you can also, when you don't know the questions that Frank had sent me. So after each question, I'll ask you if you have any comments or any questions.
We've covered
Okay.
some of it already.
I know, but let's just go over it anyway. Let's just do make it like a full thing, okay?
Okay.
All right. So the first question. Because some of them are coming in now and they don't know. Okay, so what was the Flatwoods Monster? What is the Flatwoods Monster incident? Where and when did it occur? Just go over it.
Well, Flatwoods is the geographical center of the state. And on September 12, 1952, a damaged craft flew in, passed over Braxton County, and landed on the Bailey Fisher farm on the back plateau of the property. And that's when the group of boys were playing football. It was pickup football a Friday night. And they saw this thing pass over. And that's when they went to the home of Kathleen May, two of the boys in the group. That was their mom, and they made the venture, and they went up onto the farm. And this happened, what we have here as far as our other question, was 1952 was the summer of the saucers. There was a record amount of UFO sightings reported to the United States Air Force at Blue Book. Flatwoods was just the end of the night. Nobody had ever realized how much went on back then. Now, Norene, you have to remember the media back then was radio. That wasn't far-reaching. and newspapers. So I found out that there were 10 East Coast states where the UFO sightings occurred that night, and most of the states didn't know what was going on next to them, north, south, east, or west of them. They had no idea what was going on. And when I started picking up the breadcrumb trail, that's when I started. I started out with a couple little maps and ended up with this gigantic map that's 6 by 8 feet. And I started plotting all the points together, and that's how we figured out what had happened. During that time is when we had the shoot them down orders. And then we have these 4 objects coming in, and I have actually 13 locations, Dave, pinpointed down to the area of a square mile where these things touched down and they were sighted. And, it's interesting. Where the majority of information I got was right from Project Blue Book. Detailed analysis of everything that had happened. The people would write in. They're called tentative observers questionnaires. And if somebody saw a UFO sighting, they wanted to report it, they would contact the Air Force and they would send them this questionnaire back and figure it out, and then they would send it back in. They would evaluate it and record it. Well, you have these hundreds of sightings that night, and the Air Force said it was all blamed on a fireball meteor seen for 7 seconds. And there was 21 hours of sightings that day.
And you got to remember, folks, Project Blue Book, their main mission was to debunk everything because they didn't want the public to panic. They didn't want the public to realize that we don't have control of our own airspace. That's the whole mission of Project.
Okay, question.
Especially that night where those damaged objects flew. One penetrated the Oak Ridge National Laboratory no-fly zone by 105 miles. Tried doing that today. Fly a pipe up through there, and it should have been intercepted. But they backed off on it, Dave. It was kind of a standoff. Then the other one's heading towards Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. Third one comes down over Washington. What do? If they had shot that down, Dave, picture this scene. Because they had the Combat Air Patrol that circled around Washington. You know what that is. What if they had shot that thing down and it landed in the middle of Washington?
Right.
There goes the cover story.
Yeah.
There it goes.
There goes the Roswell cover story, too, as well, because this happened right after Roswell.
Right. Just a few years after. And so they just backed off. They made the right decision, though. And I also have Stanton got this for me, and I pieced this into the book, and there's a copy of it in the book. I wanted Harry Truman's telephone memorandum, Dave. I wanted to see what was going on because I know every minute of where those UFOs were. I know their flight path trajectories, where they landed, where they touched down, when they came in looking for it. I wanted to know where Harry Truman was.
Yeah,
when all this shit was hitting the fan. Where did Truman go? Well, guess where he was? Wasn't in the White House. He was out of the office the whole time. And he had agents going in and answering his phone calls. I got the documents.
He was in his bunker.
Freeman got me the telephone memorandum for September 12th and 13th. Truman wasn't around when all this stuff was going down. He wasn't in the White House. He was gone.
Oh, man.
He had other people answering the phone for him.
In a bunker, yeah. Yeah.
I guarantee he was hidden somewhere.
Oh, yeah.
Yep.
Oh, yeah.
Or in the war room, because this stuff was going on up and down the East Coast.
Yeah.
This just wasn't a couple second thing where something flew over. These UFOs were down south and going all the way up north into the mid-Atlantic, along that whole eastern seaboard. They knew what was going on. So when those things dropped off the radar, okay, now picture this, Dave. The one that came over Washington, the flame over Washington, okay,
yeah,
that dropped down off a radar, and when it went west, the Air Force didn't know where it was. They knew they shot them down. And back in 1952, we have the 2.75-inch rockets.
Yeah.
Okay. The F-94 Seafire Starfire, the F-86 Sabre Dog, and the F-7U-3 Cutlass. They all had rockets on them. That was a nice surprise, going to intercept, and all of a sudden they're firing rockets at these things. 3 of them come in damaged. They go over the eastern seaboard, and they went towards those specific destinations. And the other one's coming up from the south. And basically, it was a rescue mission. They came in looking for them. And I did paintings, which I showed you some earlier, of every single one. My house looked like an art gallery with UFO sightings, and then with documents all over and hundreds of newspaper articles, and just piecing it all together. That's why it took so many years. So, as I said earlier in the program, Flatwoods, I knew there had to be a beginning, a middle, and an end. Beginning is when they were intercepted and shot down. The middle is when Flatwoods incident happened, and then the subsequent stuff. I tracked them going back out of the country, Dave. I know where they went. You know there was a mothership sighted that night?
Where was it at?
It was off the coast of Maryland. It sat off the coast, and it was the size of a dirigible, the size of a blimp. And it was picked up by radars and the ground observatories. And there was another one that was sighted off the coast, and it was like a beacon. At that point, they wanted to be seen. And the ground observatories were picking them up all up and down the East Coast. It's like
maybe they were trying to make first contact or something, and then our dumb butts went in there and shot at them.
Yeah.
You know?
So that was the orders. That's what I named my book. My other book is Shoot 'Em Down.
Hey,
So we had a lot of stuff going on that night.
You know, there's all this talk about Harry Truman, you know, making a deal with the aliens during that time and everything else. So it all really lines up to be this huge cover-up and conspiracy, man, that is pretty fascinating.
yeah. You know, there's a Tom Swagger in the chat room, and he said he never understood why the Flatwood Monster wasn't more famous than Roswell. They've swept it under, huh?
Tell him, Frank.
Yeah, they went in and they threatened a lot of people, scared a lot of people. One of the witnesses, who I don't want to name, he, as an adult, he didn't even want to do an interview with me. He was still scared from when he was a kid. Because the guys, which I'm just guesstimating, it was the same guys that went and spoke to Kathleen May, went to his house, and he was, his parents were told, you know, if you know what's good for your kid, you wouldn't talk about this. Because the newspapers are going up there, and these kids are talking all over the place. These articles hitting. So here come these guys from Washington hushing everybody up. Then they made a big joke out of it. And Ed Ruppelt was even quoted later in his career before he died. He says, when a really good case, I'm paraphrasing, when a good case came in, do whatever you could to discredit it. And in the Flatwoods case, it was written off as probably an owl in a tree.
Yeah, that's a joke.
You know, and that didn't go anyplace either. And, you know, but there's still people who, believe it or not, believe that. But until somebody can explain the 116 locations and what happened that night, this is the only story out there that gives it from A to Z of what actually happened, Dave. Nobody else has touched this story.
No. All right. Next question.
Go ahead.
Okay. Thank you. Okay. 1952 was often referred to as the Summer of the Saucers. Could you tell us why this phrase was given to the summer of 1952?
So that's what I reflected on a little bit earlier. June, July, August, and September. Now, September was when Flatwoods occurred. There was 1,134 reports sent to Project Blue Book out of 1,501 for the whole year. So that was the hotbed of sightings, and that's when the Washington sightings happened at the end of July.
Okay.
Then throw into the mix the shoot 'em down orders that were given at the same time as the Washington sightings.
Yep.
Oh,
And
yeah, I have
these,
that. Yeah.
yeah, and 6 weeks later, you have 4 damaged objects passing over the United States, and 2 alien sightings that they wrote off and made a big joke out of all those people in Braxton County. Dave, you wouldn't believe the stories that I heard back in the day from the people of what they said. It was disgusting how they treated these people, and I actually felt bad for the May family. And I really, it was a shame what they did to Mrs. May. But Mrs. May stood her ground. And like I says, I met with her dozens of times and talked to her 1,000 times on the phone. That's why a lot of these people who are investigating are so-called investigators. All they're doing is going off of my past research.
Absolutely.
Because these people are passed away, and every time I turn around, there's people contacting me. They're putting stuff up on YouTube. I sent you a letter. Did you get it? Yeah, it's like, they're basing documentaries on my work. All my stuff's copywritten.
Yep.
And it's like, and I hate, running bills up with my attorneys and slapping injunctions and going after them. But
Well,
I
one guy
guess,
you sent me. Now, one guy you sent me, he hid your actual footage from your documentary, your little documentary you put on your channel inside of his, so you wouldn't know until you watched it, and then it's your stuff in there. People are disgusting.
But we just keep pushing on. We keep pushing on. And like you said, I have a lot more information and a lot more drawings and illustrations of working with people. And but the good chunk is in the book. It's just I had to draw the line and edit it, Dave, because it was too big. It would have been like an encyclopedia set, and I just had to draw the line. But there's still a lot more details and a lot more stuff over the past few years.
The Flatwoods incident is bigger than Roswell cover-up wise, I think, and it's bigger than
There's more evidence.
the other case. There's more evidence, yeah. So, I mean, it's bigger than any of the the quotation mark big UFO cases, and you've got it all lined out right there, and people it does not get the credit it deserves, literally, and I hate that, and that's what we're trying to get some stuff done for you, so we'll see what happens with it.
Okay.
Yeah, it's a good story, and really happened.
Yeah.
Nobody in all the years since I came out with my first book in research has discredited or could explain this map sitting behind me. And if the people and the public knew the money that was put into this, they would have a heart attack. They have no idea, Dave. Most of the people I get, there's more money invested in this project than what people's homes are worth. And people ask me, they said, Frank, would you do this over again? And I said, certainly I would. It's been over half of my life, but I felt like I accomplished something. And the people of West Virginia respect me. There's more people that know me in West Virginia than down here in Florida, because I was up there for so many years on the news stations and doing interviews and book signings. And I went to bat for that group of people up there. And they weren't embarrassed anymore. When I started pulling out my information, you can't discredit it. So people don't talk about it, Dave. The skeptics don't talk about it. Stanton Friedman told me the skeptics go after the weak ones.
Yeah.
And there's too much information. And right here in this book, over a pound of paperwork, 90% of what's in here happened on the 12th, Dave. Couple pages in here are from the 13th. And here's probably something that most people never saw, because I don't think they even have this on format. There's the original microfilm. This whole goddamn thing, 90% of that is just for September 12th.
Oh my God.
And when I got other reels too, when I was doing research for the Shoot 'em Down with the Washington sightings, and there's several days, and some of these reels have weeks on them. This is just about 90% of that is for the 12th. That's why when I printed it out there and I went and I showed that to Mrs. May, and then I showed it to Freddie, that's when they really woke up. Mrs. May had no idea the Air Force was that deeply involved in it. Even though they came and visited her, that was it. She didn't hear anything else from them. Even Levitt told me when he shipped the stuff off, I said, "Did you ever hear anything back?" He says, "No, they never do. They never call you back."
Well, you know why? Because everybody, especially in those days, everybody trusted the government, and they said they did what the government said. So if the government discredited the original eyewitnesses, they were done, and that's how it was. So, they figured they were done with it, and that is it. They discredited it. It was an owl. It was this. It was that. Those people are crazy, whatever the case. And, that's why it kind of went bye-bye under the rug. And then you resurrected that whole thing, and laid it out for people to see. So it's there. It's in plain sight. A fifth grader could put the dots together because of the way you put it together for everybody to see. A fifth grader could say, "Holy crap, look at this," and deduce what happened. It's so obvious, it's ridiculous.
And Dave, what I actually did in my book, I have the locations where every UFO was seen that night in the back of my book. Every single location is documented.
And that was on the
116 locations are all documented and pinpointed with times. And like I said, a lot of it was in Project Blue Book. Then when I would find out locations within Project Blue Book, then I would contact, because I couldn't afford to go traveling in jets up and down the East Coast. I would call up the local libraries where these sightings took place, and they would send me more articles. And this is back in the old days where I would send them money orders or whatever, and they would send them back to me in a box. And that's how it just kept snowballing and snowballing.
And we didn't have the luxury of the internet back in those days where it was much easier to communicate,
Right. And that's what people don't realize. Even how much the area has changed up there over the years is incredible.
Oh, yeah. The legwork that you put in on this is phenomenal, the way you had to go about it back in those early days. And like you said, I believe you're right. I think it happened, it was before your time. You did this before. Now look at what's going on. And I wrote a UFO book too, and now that we're getting the government coming out and eyewitnesses and all these whistleblowers, it feels really good to get that validation, man.
Absolutely.
There's all these people, "Oh, you guys are crazy. There's no such thing as you." Yeah, okay. Look at what they're saying now all over TV. The Washington Post putting articles out and big time name people saying, "Yeah, there's something to this." And it's not what the government's saying it is. So it's something much, much bigger. And the validation at least has to make you feel good,
See this map behind me? This was in West Virginia for the Monster Quest show.
Mm-hmm.
And that crew's eyes almost fell out of their head. And I stood there and gave them a little lecture of it. And they looked at the whole thing. And guess what? They didn't air it.
No.
The map was never shown on national television.
Go figure.
And there's the chunk of the proof of the information right there. Flatwoods was just a little part of the story of what happened that night.
Okay.
Everything else that surrounded it.
Okay, I have another question.
Planes and missing pilots.
Okay, so Frank, the summer of the saucers was the summer of 1952, but it was revealed that July 28th, 1952, this July, that the Air Force gave orders for shoot down. So
Right.
so this all happened in September, but how come in July, what was going on in July that they gave the orders to shoot down?
Well, there were orders prior to this, but the Air Force just revealed it in the end of July. The orders had been out there, but what was going on, the public was panicking. There were sightings every day throughout the summer. And then when they were the back-to-back weekends where they sent jets out to try and intercept the UFOs over Washington, and they had to do something. The panic was starting to set in. It was a flap. It was near, epidemic proportions. Is that the right word, Dave? Epidemic proportions?
Sure. Yeah, because it was literally, really the whole year in 1952, there was sightings galore, man. And that's when, like Frank said, that's when the Air Force secretly put out the orders for these pilots to chase these things and shoot them down. Because there were sightings everywhere, all over.
But what was going on in 1952 that all this activity is happening? What happened? Why? Why
I think
1952?
That's the year they wanted to make communication with us. That's what I've been told with the researchers and the people I've talked to over 30 years. They said they believe that was the year they wanted to make contact. They were surveying the country. They knew all our military installations were. It just wasn't an accident. They happened to fly towards those particular target zones. Oak Ridge, right of Washington. There weren't meteors that fell out of the sky. And that's what got me going on this, Dave. I knew this Flatwoods monster just didn't drop out of outer space or crawl out of a hole in the woods. It came from someplace. And then I worked in reverse from Flatwoods back out to the East Coast, and then everything that was encompassed the whole story. That's why it took that many years to write.
Yeah.
So like I said, I worked with a lot of military guys. I didn't figure this out on my own. It probably would have taken me 100 years if I had to do this by myself. But I had some good people working with me.
Okay, and I know you had talked about this earlier, that on the 9th of September 12th, there were 4 UFOs that were shot down. What were their locations?
Those are the ones that came over the mid-Atlantic, over the eastern seaboard. One came up from the direction of Florida, and the other 3 came over the eastern seaboard.
So...
And there was 116 locations that I figured out and pinpointed. And out of those 4 UFOs accounted for 13 crash sites. And I got the locations of every crash site.
Did they pick up the debris? Did the government
Yes,
go?
they did.
They did all of it?
And there's still probably some debris floating around the farm, Dave. God only knows who found it, because there was hundreds and thousands of people up there.
Yeah, they came
And
all over.
grabbed some of it. Haley Stewart, the reporter, got some of it. And then it got stolen from them. So it could be sitting in somebody's shoebox in the attic in Flatwoods.
Yeah.
We wouldn't know. That farm was so big, and the whole area was so big of where this thing occurred. God only knows where the oil. That farm had to be covered with oil.
Oh.
So who got all this oil? There's somebody out there watching that probably knows. The military didn't get all of it.
No, there's no way. They probably just covered it up with dirt.
Damn. Okay, so the other stuff you've covered, I'm not going to ask you, but I do want you to talk about, you only just touched on it, the, we have the F-94C Starfire jet, and that was, hold on, let me get this.
Yeah, the Air Force had rocket-bearing jets.
And the airman that vanished.
Yeah, that was John Anderson Jones Jr. and John Del Curto. They were flying their F-94 Starfire off the coast of Florida, and they were said to be on a routine weather training mission. And that story took me years to investigate, and I have a whole other map on top of that. I know what happened to that jet within a minute or two of the whole night when I first found out about it, because I live in Florida and the pilot was from Sanford, which is Sanford, Florida, about half an hour, 40 minutes from where I live. It was in the Daytona Beach News Journal, and I found it in a microfilm reel. And then I contacted the Air Force, and I wanted more records on it, and they had no records of it.
Yeah.
Then when I started looking into it a little bit closer, there was no Social Security death index, there no birth certificates, there was nothing. These guys were wiped off the planet Earth. There was not a goddamn record about them any place, which was kind of crazy. So I got a couple letters from the Air Force to back it up, how they had no record of this incident. And I actually had, what's that, Dave?
Which is total BS. They have records on. They knew exactly what happened.
Well, when I actually contacted the brothers of the two missing airmen, and one of them actually saved the Western Union telegrams from General Chidlaw, which showed these guys did exist.
Yeah.
I got all the official telegrams, and I got every newspaper article written about it. And it's kind of funny, the story never reached outside of Florida. It was one of the biggest air-sea rescues in history, and they found nothing. The guys vanished while being in a radar net across the Gulf of Mexico.
I'll tell you, I was in the Air Force, and one of my jobs under Incident Investigation Command, when a pilot crashes or an aircraft, that's an Air Force aircraft, when we had to go out there and we had to pick up every single piece of that airplane and the bodies and put them in baggies and mark it, and it's all mapped out and everything else. Trust me, when I say they know everything, they know everything. Because I was involved in that process. So they're full of it.
So
what happened is when this plane disappeared, nobody had any records of it. There were no records of the men. There was no records of the incident. Well, I got the documents, those Western Union telegrams, from the pilot's brother, who since passed away. He saved them in a shoebox and had them in his house in Sanford, Florida. And he mailed them to me. And I wrote my first book. I wrote about that. And I actually went and found a memorial grave tombstone for him. And I wrote about that in the book. Well, coincidentally, a few months after my book came out, and I did tons of radio shows with Stanton talking about there were no records, the Air Force released the records, and I got the aircraft accident report.
Mm-hmm.
And Dave, that report, I hate to say it, looked like it was written by a kindergarten class. What was in the accident report was completely different from the Western Union telegrams. It was different from the commander at Tyndall Air Force Base. There's a letter here, and all the Florida newspaper that covered it. Every story was different. Like Flatwoods, I went, oh my God, here we go again. One incident and 10 different stories.
Yeah, it's totally part of the cover-up process. There's tower flight logs of every single plane that takes off and lands. There's logs out the yin-yang that the Air Force does when every single plane takes off, where they're tracked on radar and everything else. So it's total obvious cover-up. I mean, it's obvious.
And the plane was never found. To this day, it's never been found.
It never been found?
The
Do you
critics
think?
that have come after me about this missing jet, you know what I tell them, Dave? You put that Starfire on my front lawn, I got a big yard. You put that Starfire on my front yard, and I'll give up the UFO research and I'll never write another thing about a missing jet. Well, in 30 years, nobody's put a starfire on my front lawn yet. And there's been a lot of jets that vanished over that area, Dave, throughout the United States and throughout the world. I wrote it and Shoot 'em down. Hundreds of pilots have vanished and disappeared. Hundreds of them.
Okay,
Yeah.
are you talking around the Bermuda Triangle?
No, all
No,
over the world.
all over the
Oh.
world. Most of it's over the continental United States. If you go on my FlatwoodsMonster.com website, there's a big section there with the missing pilots, and that whole book is a shame of how these guys were written off. World War II fighter pilots, aces, guys who fought in the Korean War. They were aces. They come back. They vanish into thin air where their jets crash. You know, there was tons of stuff like that.
We
These
had
guys,
a
hundreds
West
of
Virginia.
combat missions. Then they die here. They come back and disappear
Yeah.
during the shoot down orders.
Yeah.
There.
Okay, well, the pilot and his radar specialist, whatever he was, they couldn't find his plane. Do you think they were shot down by a UFO?
Absolutely.
Oh, they were?
Well, we had a famous story.
They haven't come up with a better idea for me yet.
Well,
That's
look
what
at
the whole story's based on.
Look at the Manziel story too. That guy. He was a decorated World War II pilot. He's from West Virginia. He was in Kentucky, and he was chasing an object, and he crashed and burned too.
Yeah, Thomas Mantell.
Yeah. Mantell.
So the Air Force must have known that, and that's why it's a big hush-hush thing.
Absolutely.
Wow.
Those guys were in voice communication with the tower who was bringing them into land, and just vanished thin air. They never attempted to bail out. Why, if you're going down in a voice command with your control tower, why would you not bail out?
Right.
Yeah.
Wow.
And they never found that jet. They never found any wreckage. They never found any bodies. And like I said, it was one of the biggest air and sea rescue missions.
But Frank,
out there.
wait a minute. How do you know they didn't find it and they're just saying that?
No, they never found them.
Uh,
They never found anything.
They
The Air
got-
Force finally released its records. As
Yeah.
of today, if you look that jet up on a database, it's still missing in action.
But wait a minute. If you think that they were shot or they were collided or shot down, taken out by a UFO, wouldn't their plane have pieces all over the place and something would be there?
Not unless they were vaporized or sucked into the mothership.
Oh God,
You know.
vaporized? Oh my God.
They were
Okay.
probably, if they were shot down by an alien object, I'm sure they were probably vaporized into nothing.
Yeah. Oh my God, that's terrible.
Or they could have been picked up. I mean, they could have. Look at the Flight 19 incident. Those planes have never been found
No,
either.
no.
Pilot.
Right
No.
off the coast of Florida.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Look at the
was-
end of Close Encounters, Dave. Even though it's a sci-fi movie, it was based on fact. What happened to the mothership when it opened up at the end? All
Yeah.
the pilots kept walking out. Everybody forgets about that part of the story.
Yeah. They're
All the missing pilots from the 40s and 50s.
Yep.
And I believe that's what has happened and where so many of these guys have went.
God.
They knew the exact location of that plane when it vanished. And when they went there, it wasn't there. They knew. Dave, I tracked out the coordinates, and they were lies. I put it all together. I knew what that plane did every minute. They were chasing a flying saucer. They
Yeah.
goofed up with their coordinates, and me and one of my Air Force guys picked up on it. And we're like, boy, Dave, whoever thought all these years later somebody was going to scrutinize and go through these documents and tear them apart like I did? Nobody. It was a lost story. They wrote it off. They wrote Flatwoods off, and nobody ever pieced it together. It was a big
Wow.
jigsaw puzzle thrown into the wind.
This is really
Yep.
fascinating. Really fascinating. God, what a story. Well, I don't know why you don't make a documentary, Frank, with all the information that you have.
Well, I have a short documentary that's on YouTube.
But I know, but you have more information. Look at that reel that you have. You have all kinds of stuff.
He needs a couple of movies. He needs
Yeah.
a movie and a documentary movie, full blown, probably multiple movies made about this.
Absolutely. Part 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10.
Yep.
All it takes is money, right, Dave?
That's right.
Oh my God! What a this.
How much is 30 plus years of research worth, Frank?
Yeah. You aren't kidding.
God.
Yep.
Wow. Well, that
Just
was.
the time alone, let alone the money.
Right.
What a that
Millions
was
of
fascinating.
dollars.
Wow.
Millions of dollars. Yeah.
God. Well, this was really a fascinating show. I'm really glad that you came on and told the viewers. That I saw in the chat room a lot of them didn't know anything about it. I didn't know anything about it but only because of Dave. So I mean, it's really a fascinating story, and I still can't. I'm not satisfied. I'm still not satisfied. Crazy.
There's so much to it, and there's parts that probably no one will ever know that the government knows about, and whatnot. So that's just how it is when it goes with these cover-ups, man.
Yeah. Wow. Well,
Frank did a pretty damn good job documenting it all. I'd say that.
oh my God. Really unbelievable.
Because it would have, if it wasn't for him, it would still be just known as folklore and mythology. I mean, literally, because it was pushed under the rug until he resurrected the whole thing. And then, he's getting more and more pieces of information over the years. So, he's the man on it for sure. 100%.
Absolutely.
Hey,
Wow.
how long did you live up there in Gasaway? Did you go up there as a kid?
No, well, back in the day, so get this. Back in the day when I was born, that was the closest hospital, and then I lived right on the Nicholas County, Braxton County line. My mom and them, so that was I was coming, and that was it. They got me right over there. I got my mom there, and I was born there. But I probably lived like 10 miles from 15 miles from Gasaway when I was a little kid. And then, over the years, my mom and dad had got divorced, so I'd go back and forth visiting, staying with both sets of my grandparents and my dad and everybody. And, just grew up to hearing all these stories and how, my aunt or my mom's first cousin, which is my second cousin, she told me stories. They were so terrified because they went to school with the May brothers and all that, and they were so terrified that and people are really poor, Frank will tell you, around here. Back in those days, and they had outhouses. They still didn't have, a lot of these places didn't have running water and bathrooms. So they had to use the bathroom in the outhouse, and they were so scared they didn't go to the outhouse to use the bathroom, and they'd go pee off the porch, and they got their mom and them would catch them and whip their butts for not going to the outhouse and stuff. And it was a big to-do around here for many, many years. Well, they would tell the kids that the Braxton County Monster is going to get you, or the Flatwoods Monster is going to get you. And it has multiple names because it's in Braxton County, so they call it the Braxton County Monster. But it happened in Flatwoods, which is in Braxton County.
Right.
So it's got 2 or 3 names. They call it Braxy and all kinds of stuff. So.
Okay, I have a question. How many sightings did this monster have, and then it went away?
Well, it was sighted on the farm during the encounter with the boys and Mrs. May, and then it was seen the following night out of its spacesuit. I think after that, they say, we're going to stay away from this country. They're shooting at us. Those American jets are shooting. And the Air Force made no bones about it. They wanted a flying saucer technology. They wanted to do reverse engineering. There was even stuff I've read where they would tell their pilots to aim their jets at the craft, at the UFOs, and bail out and shoot it, use it as a guided missile. I mean, they wanted, it's well documented. Donald Keogh talked about it for years. The Air Force wanted one. They wanted one bad. Do anything you can to get one.
Wow.
And they did. They got 4 of them down that night. But then look what happened.
And there's all kind of other stories where they have downed UFOs and we have them, reverse engineering them and stuff. But that's crazy. 4 in one night, It's hard for me to fathom that we had a good enough technology to actually shoot one of these things down. It just blows my mind. Where did we get that technology from? Roswell? I mean, what's going on here?
Those jets had computers on board, Dave. Like the Starfire.
Mm-hmm.
That would basically, the guy would take their hands off of the stick and they would put it on automatic computer, the pilot, and the jet would actually fly and chase the target. The pilots didn't even have to be there. And then it would predict the precise moment to fire the rockets. The pilots didn't have to do anything except sit there and take off and land it. Right. And a lot of the guys didn't like that. They didn't like that advanced technology.
Yeah,
they wanted to fly and have control over their jet. That was like a roller coaster ride. Chasing something going like this through the sky, and you're going.
Yeah, people didn't realize we had that type of technology back then. They don't realize we had a lot more advanced technology than they even realized. I mean,
they never flew those jets over Korea during the war because they were scared if they had crashed, the Russians would get the technology. So they kept the best jets over here stateside around the perimeter of Washington.
Yep.
On the eastern seaboard, protecting the mid-Atlantic area. There's so many sightings in this book, and so many of them I didn't write, but once you read the book, you get the idea of what was going on.
Well, weren't they using those rockets? That's why they were using those certain jets?
Yeah, they were folding fin aerial rockets. The 2.75-inch Mighty Mouse rockets. That would have been a surprise because they were firing bullets up to that point. So these UFOs knew that, as Donald Keogh had spoke about for years, that it's like they would play cat and mouse with the fighter jets. Let them catch up, back off, go ahead. They were just playing cat and mouse to see what our technology was like. And then all of a sudden, they come roaring out of the gates and they're flying through the sky shooting rockets. That had to have been a surprise.
Yeah.
And who knows the technology of what these crafts that they shot were. We don't know how advanced they were. We may never know. But on that particular night, there was oval objects seen, there was cigar-shaped objects, and there was saucers seen, Dave. There was saucer-shaped crafts that night as well. It was like a whole array of different varieties. Like the kids, when I was doing the book tours, the kids would say, well, look out the window. How many different kinds of cars and models of cars do you see out there? And there's tons of them. Just the same thing with these crafts. We don't know where they're from or why they look that way.
Yeah, they portrayed that in Close Encounters, all the different little ships there were. There was all kinds of different ones. There's a little boy pointed and said, ice cream, mommy, or whatever.
Oh,
So a lot of that Close Encounter movie is based off of real stuff. And, at one point, they actually were supposed to have some real footage in there that the government had, and that got pulled, from what I understand.
Oh, really?
The government contracted with the original filmmaker before Spielberg took over. And that's a whole fascinating story, too.
Wow. Huh. Oh, God. You guys, it's 12:30, almost 12:30.
Yeah.
Wow. Okay,
You know, to do a follow-up show, Noreen.
oh God, yes. Whatever you want to do, I'm
And
always
we'll
here.
just talk about Flatwoods next
Oh
time.
yeah,
Now we kind of
really.
laid out the whole scenario of why these UFOs were down and what caused them to go down. And I don't think anybody's come up with a better reason why 4 damaged aircraft went down that night during the shoot 'em down era. And then
Yeah.
that's the other book, Dave. There's a whole book just written about the shoot 'em down incidents and missing pilots.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, that'd be a good
So
show.
all those pieces fit together. They were just fragmented all over the place. And that's what Stanton was amazed at. Even he admitted, he said, I missed a lot of this stuff. He missed it. But once you get onto the trail of it, everything starts falling into place.
Yeah, let's do it. Let's do it.
All right, very good.
Okay,
All right.
guys, thank you so much. That was really great. The viewers are still hanging out. It was a good show, and thank you. It was very nice to meet you, Frank.
Thank you, Noreen.
Thank you so much. And Dave, my buddy, always love to have you around. Okay, all right, well, set up another show. The 3 of us.
All right.
Told you you'd love it.
Yep. I love the Flatwood Monster. I mean, I'll never get over it. I mean, I love it. All right, so thank you so much. Have a great weekend, and thank you for being on the show. Dave, set it up with Frank, and just let me know, okay?
All right.
Okay,
will do.
thank you. Good night. Thank you.
Night,
All right,
folks.
Thank you. Good night.
Bye-bye.
Oh, boy. Well, you guys, you stayed up late tonight. Poor Tall Cross. It must be 5 o'clock or 6 o'clock in the morning. You've been up all night, you poor thing. I'm so exhausted now. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. I hope you enjoyed the show. It was something that, I mean, I love this topic, so I was really excited to do this. Let me see, where am I? Okay, am I still have my audio? Okay, so thank you so much. My next, because I was sick. I had the virus, and so I had to change it. So that's why I have back-to-back shows. So next Thursday, I have a Tom Schroeder. He's the one that he interviewed children that had past lives, and so he has a book out. I haven't had a chance to read it, but should be an interesting show. And then on the Sunday, the 30th, I think. The 23rd. Jen's going to do a show with me. Frank Feschino asked us to do a show on this Christopher Tompkin. I didn't know anything about him, but he was on a job out in the field, and he went to go check on something, and poof, he disappeared. They found part of his shirt on a barbed wire, one of his work boots hanging off of the barbed wire. So this is a show that was requested by Frank, so we're going to do that, and that'll be on the 23rd. It's quite a story. So guys, thank you so much. Do you mind if I'm not going to do shout outs tonight, but I really okay. Thank you. Okay, Terry and Renee, thank you so much, my mods. I love you guys so much. Let me do a quick shout out. Vipers Realty. Oh, I haven't seen you in a long time, Vipers. Hold on. A Tall Cross, my buddy from Scotland. Thank you so much. Time for you to go to bed, honey. Deck Magnet, and I hope you're doing okay. I hope you guys are doing okay. So, Tall, I haven't talked to you. I know you fell again, but I hope you're doing okay. Take care of yourself, please. Guys, send your positive thoughts and prayers to Tall Cross, please. All right, Deck Magnet, Tom Swager. Alonzo Calderon, I see who's left. The Phantom. I know Christopher Chris was in. I saw him earlier. Okay, so yeah, I Am Alpha. I know Lisa was in. Oh, King of Hugo Mundo. You're still up. Thank you so much, Gordon Pendersquash. Okay. Must not have been a nice one. Anybody else want to shout out? Okay, I think that's about it. All right, so I'll see you next Thursday, okay? Next Thursday and then Sunday the 23rd. Okay, so guys, thank you so much. There's a big lag in the show tonight. I'm so glad we got it going. There was problems. Actually, my techie, like I said, my techie said that one of the towers of Skype went down and caused a lot of issues tonight. So I'm really glad that we were able to finish the show. So again, thank you so much. I love you guys. Have a great weekend, and I'll see you next Thursday, okay? Good night, everybody. Thank you. Oh, Lisa, there you are. Thank you. Good night. Love you guys. And my mods, Renee and Chipper. Thank you, honey. Love you guys. Oh, Karen Piotti. Bye. Sun. Lori Miller. There you guys are. You're hiding. Good night, everybody. Love you. Thank you. Love you. Good night.